Welcome to War Room, the official podcast of the U.S. Army War College online journal, graciously supported by the Army War College Foundation. Please join the conversation at warroom.armywarcollege.edu. We hope you enjoy the program.
Make sure not to miss a single podcast and subscribe to A Better Peace, the War Room podcast, at iTunes, Google Play, or your favorite subscription service. The views expressed in this presentation are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect those of the U.S. Army War College, U.S. Army, or Department of Defense.
I'm Michael Neiberg, Chair of War Studies at the U.S. Army War College here in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Welcome to A Better Peace, the War Room podcast. I'm here today with my friend Steve Vogel, former reporter for the Washington Post who covered military and veterans affairs. He was overseas for the fall of the Berlin Wall, and he's been all over the world covering war and conflict. Steve is also the author of 3 books, The Pentagon, A History, Through the Perilous Fight, about the battle in the Chesapeake Bay and the burning of the White House, and most recently, Betrayal in Berlin, a wonderful spy story about an incident that happened in that city during the Cold War. Steve, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be with you, Mike.
Steve, you and I first met when you were, I think the Pentagon had just come out or was about to come out, and we met on the Department of the Army's Historical Advisory Committee in a Pentagon conference room. And I remember you telling me about that book coming out. And I think you and I had a conversation, I want to say over lunch, about the very 2 different kinds of writing styles that you were dealing with, one as a journalist and one as an historian. Do you see those as 2 different ways of trying to write, or do you see them as kind of synergistic and building upon one another?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I see a lot of similarities. I mean, there are certain things, of course, the immediate pressure of getting a deadline story out versus, the more taking the long view, taking more time to really fully develop a story. But I think fundamentally, they're very much alike. In fact, I've tried to use some of my journalism techniques to put those to use in the books I've written, just in terms of having a story that kind of flows, that keeps the reader engaged. I mean, that's basically what journalism is in a way, is trying to keep readers hooked on a story, and you kind of lead them on, and they kind of want to know where they're going, but they want some surprises and adventures along the way.
Yeah, I guess that's the difference, right? I mean, at least to me, trained as an academic historian, we're supposed to sort of not treat our writing as a whodunit. We're supposed to kind of, give the argument up front, give the argument again, and reinforce the argument at the end. We're not really trained to write in quite the same way. So what I think what I'm hearing you say is you don't necessarily see a tension in those things. You're trying to tell a narrative story in the same way in long form that you would in short form.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, I'm trying to tell these stories in a chronological fashion too. I'm trying not to just be sitting 50 years on and sort of being the voice of God and telling what happened in the past. I'm trying to put the reader there at the moment, understand, what the characters that I'm writing about, what they know, what their problems are, what challenges they're facing, kind of put the reader in the shoes of the people I'm writing about. Again, that's something that I think a lot of good journalism does.
And one thing we don't do as historians, of course, at least normally some do, is to interview the people that we're writing about. So you have the opportunity when you're doing journalism, of course, you talk to people who are involved in these stories. But when you're writing something like the 1812 campaign, that's not possible. So do you find that to be a little difficult in trying to get in the minds of people that you can't talk to?
In a way, I was fearing that might be the case. But the thing is that so many people from that era wrote such beautiful letters. I mean, that's one of the real gems, one of the real pleasures of writing about a period, say, 200 years ago, is how much better the written form was than today. I mean, I sort of pity, in a way, the historians who are going to be trying to piece together history based on text messages or or Twitter feeds or something like that. I mean, because people just really, this is, people like Francis Scott Key or the British admiral who attacked Washington, George Coburn. They had a wonderful way of words. They would sit down and just write these long letters with brilliant asides and witty comments about the people that they were encountering, and it just in a way you feel like you're in a way interviewing these people, or at least you're having a conversation with them, particularly if you could find a series of letters that go back and forth. You can kind of sort of get a flow of actual conversation rather than just dry words from memorandum or something like that. You can actually have these characters speak again in the words that they were actually using at the time.
The frustration for me is I'll hear somebody or read something where someone will say, well, I wish I had more time to tell you about X. And I'm thinking, no, that's what I want to hear. You can't talk to the person and say, tell me more about that, or ask a question that they're not addressing. So sometimes the frustration is that the sources aren't telling you the information that you actually want. And sometimes it's not telling you the information in the format that you want.
Yeah. I mean, in doing interviews, for the Berlin book, I remember one of the Army Corps of Engineers officers I spoke with was, he I reached him, 3 or 4 times over the telephone. Was trying to set up an in-person interview, and he was, he's about 88 years old at the time, and he had great stories to tell, but he was always, so busy with what he was doing at the moment that he said, well, let's talk soon. I'm busy right now. I'm working on a family history project. And, about the 4th time I said, I'm going to keep you on the phone. Let's just, I just kept on asking him questions about, well, tell me a little bit about this first. And, you kind of get a conversation going. And, I hate to say it, particularly in, when you're dealing with people who are in their late 80s or 90s, you don't know when you're going to get another chance to speak with them. And that's always my first priority in working on a book of fairly recent history, is to get to the people involved as soon as possible, because you never know what might happen down the road.
So what's your academic background? Were you a history major or journalism major as an undergrad?
I was actually a political science major at the College of William & Mary, what they called a government department. But I took a lot of history at William & Mary, and I also, took a lot of English courses. And then as a graduate student, I was studying international relations at Johns Hopkins SICE, the School of Advanced International Studies. So where I studied with Elliot Cohen in his strategic studies program, which really focuses a lot on military history. So I did have a lot of exposure from that standpoint, but I'm not a formally trained historian such as yourself.
So, or a formally trained journalist, or did that come at some point as well?
With journalism, I kind of come from the old school where, back when I first started working at a newspaper in the early 80s, a lot of editors still preferred their reporters to get, their training, their journalism training in the field versus in a school. Mm-hmm. And you kind of the first newspaper I worked for was in Alexandria, Virginia, and it was a little weekly that covered everything from the all the city council and the police and courts to what was going on with the Alexandria minor league baseball team, the Dukes that they used to have, and so you as a journalist you get to do a little bit of everything. I felt at times I was doing everything but sweeping up the floors at night, because you're working, you're taking photos, you're helping with the layout of the stories, and you learn the business. And I had a great editor, Jim Goldsmith, who worked for the AP over in Tokyo and had lots of experience. And for me, that was, I think, a better way to learn journalism than going to journalism school, where, to my way of thinking, I would rather have had the time to study history and political science, because those are often things that I write about, than learning the craft of journalism in school. I felt it was better for me to actually learn by doing. And
this is the kind of newspaper that, unfortunately, we just don't have that many of anymore, right? The industry has changed so much.
Oh, it's horrible.
So obviously, you didn't go overseas covering a war for a newspaper in Alexandria. So what was the first overseas assignment that you had? Was it Berlin?
Well, basically what happened was, I was working as a local journalist in Northern Virginia. Really enjoyed it, but I did want to go overseas. And you're right, the journal, the Alexandria Journal that I was working for didn't have need of a coverage from Germany or anywhere else in
Yeah,
particular.
probably
That
didn't
was
have a Sarajevo bureau in that,
no,
in that newspaper, right? Yeah.
no, exactly. But what happened was the journal was actually owned by the Army Times publishing company. So the Army Times folks were right upstairs from us, based in Northern Virginia. And I just, I knew the editor of Army Times, and Tom Donnelly, and I said, hey, if I went over to Germany, would you be interested in some freelance stories? And he was like, yes. This was
And this was what year?
1989. This is the summer basically of 89. So about
Uh-huh.
this is 3-4 months before the wall came down. But things were percolating a
Good
little bit.
timing.
Yeah,
Yeah, good
yeah.
timing.
I mean, I wish I could say I really knew what was going to happen, but the truth is, a friend of mine wanted to go to Oktoberfest, and I said, "Oh well, I'll go with you. We'll go to Oktoberfest. I'm going to stick around and try my luck at freelancing." So I mean that's basically the good timing I had.
No, we're going to work on that story because of your knowledge of history. You knew something was going to happen, so you wanted to get there. So did you had been to Berlin before, right? If I remember, you had been there with your father. Is that right?
Yeah. So my dad was based in Berlin as an undercover officer with the CIA, something I knew nothing about, but of course would eventually learn many years later. But we were there. He was stationed there starting in 1957. I was born in 1960, and the wall went up while we were there, which is a pretty exciting time, needless to say. And I'd gone back to Berlin as a German language student, basically after finishing high school, where I studied German. My class, 3 or 4 classmates, and our German teacher went on a long bike trip, mostly through Germany. So, we had plenty of chances to use our German, staying in youth hostels. And we went to Berlin at that time and through Checkpoint Charlie. And, that was, of course, very dramatic and exciting. This was 1978, so very much the height of the Cold War. And so coming back again in 89 as a journalist I certainly felt a connection to the city, and having been there when the wall went up, to be lucky enough to be there when it came down was pretty cool.
Yeah, that's pretty remarkable, actually, to be there when it went up and when it came down.
Right.
So
yeah.
Do you think that experience being in Germany, I mean, did that help to sharpen your kind of interest in history and the way that big stories kind of have a background to them?
Yeah, I mean, certainly having that life experience in Berlin. And we also, my dad was also stationed in Mexico and Islamabad, Pakistan, and Argentina. So having that experience as a kid, kind of living in these pretty exotic places and being somewhat connected to big events that were happening around the globe, certainly, fostered a curiosity, I guess, and a an interest in learning more about some of these places where we lived, and being aware of some of the history that I might not have had that experience if I just been growing up in the States.
Yeah, because I think it's one of those things. I think too many historians, we write sometimes about the past without necessarily connecting it to the future. And too many journalists write about the present without understanding the past that created what they're writing about. And you have the background to kind of do both, which is important. And the Berlin book is a pretty good example of that, and an understanding of how the time period you're writing about, this espionage story that you tell, how that came to be in the first place and why it matters.
Yeah, I mean, learning the backstory, as we sometimes call it, is just really, I think, critical for telling the story smartly, or in a way that you can really explain better to your readers why certain things are happening or why they matter, and what the story is on some of the characters you're trying to introduce to the readers. You don't just kind of throw, for example, the CIA Berlin-based chief, who's a prime character in the Berlin book, Bill Harvey. You don't just want to throw him out there and just, because he's kind of an interesting character, who throws martinis down and carries about 6 or 8 guns on his person as he's going to virtually anywhere he's going. He's loaded with ammunition and weaponry. You kind of want to tell where these people came from, and that's even more so of George Blake, the British spy who ends up betraying the tunnel, because he has a pretty fascinating backstory. So yeah, I think that is an important part of what I try to do as a journalist and a writer of nonfiction history.
And so much of this, so the two books the two of the books you've done have been very modern. The Pentagon, a building that you worked in a lot, that you must have been thinking about the history of that building every day. Then Berlin, where you have this very close history to that city. Then you write this book on 1812, which I know some of the events took place very close to where you live, but it's a very different time period. How hard was it for you to sort of get your head into the early 19th century? We historians typically don't jump out of time periods all that often. If we do, it's usually a challenge for us, because the specialists in that time period sometimes push back on us a little bit. So did you feel you had a little more freedom to do that than maybe I would have?
I guess it's a certain, ignorance and arrogance that a journalist has, to think that, I'll just parachute, into this place and time and see what I can find out. I think, to me, first of all, the specialists, the historians that I encountered on the 1812 story were just uniformly gracious and helpful, and just it's a fairly small fraternity, say, compared to the Civil War or a period like that. So the people I encountered, everybody from Don Hickey, who's the sort of the dean of 1812 history, to some of the specialists in the Chesapeake theater that I was writing about, people like Ralph Eshelman. They were just, wonderful hosts. I'd go on tours with Ralph. We would go by boat and land to all these sites. They really embraced me, and they kind of, I think, welcomed in a sense, having a fresh eye, and someone who was enthusiastic about the story. I mean, that's the other thing that you have to have. To me, it's not so important, whether that's your specialty or this is what. It's more importantly more important that you really feel enthusiastic about the story. And to me, the entire story of the Chesapeake campaign in the War of 1812 was just amazing, and one that's pretty much overlooked in American history by a lot of folks.
This is something I do all the time. When people come to me and they say, I've got an idea to write a book on X, I say to them, are you ready to live with X for the next 5, 7, 8, 10 years of your life? Because that's what it very well could be. It's very difficult to sort of close the door on a project like that.
Yeah, I mean, and completely true. And I have withdrawal all the time with the 1814 stuff these days. And in fact, some of the folks I met are disappointed that mad at me that that I moved 150 years to the future, to the Cold War, but I'm still in touch with them, and I I don't feel like I'm closing the door on that forever, because I still have that bug that there's so many great stories to go back to there, and so I've kept all my notes and materials and books. They're overflowing in my office as we speak.
Yeah, I think we all have that problem. Another thing that you and I have in common, and I don't think when I first met you, I wasn't working yet at the Army War College, but we both have that sort of historical mind, and we work every day with the DoD, and we work every day with kind of looking at the way that military professionals deal with problems that we've looked at in the past. So I guess I'm curious too, whether your face as an historian and your face as a journalist, whether each of those helps you understand the other a little bit better, because I think that working at the War College has helped me to understand the way that organizations like Army solve problems today. It helps me better understand how they solved them in the past. Has that been true for you too?
Yeah, I mean, I think having both of those hats really helps you, view the other. I mean, sometimes, I read stories in the newspapers or elsewhere in the media that I can see really leave out important historic context, And I can completely understand the frustration of someone who's a specialist in that field, and who sees all the mischaracterizations or just misunderstandings that are perpetuated in a lot of media accounts that repeat the same mistakes over and over. It's very frustrating. But on the other hand, I can also understand where the journalist is coming from, where they sometimes get hammered by a historian for not including all the context or everything, and the journalist has oftentimes a set amount of space or
a couple hundred words.
Right, you're right, or even or just the need to keep the story moving and not lose the reader with too much detail. And I'm someone who was constantly fighting that battle, because as a newspaper reporter at the Post, I was always trying to cram more stuff in, and the editors were saying, wait, the story's too long, we got to cut this, but this is so important. And so it's like it's a constant battle where you want to keep the story concise and clean, but you want it to be as accurate as possible. It's a constant battle.
So we're running out of time already, which is unfortunate, but I want to ask you a couple of questions. I want to ask you what your experience working in archives is like, because for most professional historians like myself, that's a formal training process we go through to try to figure out how to do that. And I'm guessing you didn't have a master's or PhD level history class on how to deal with archives. So what was that like, especially for the 1812 book, to step into something that must have been unfamiliar to you? Am I right?
Not completely, because at William and Mary, I had some great history professors that that made us really work through the archives. I took a course on the invasion of North America, was basically looking at the colonization from the perspective of Native Americans, and my professor just had us go way back into the William and Mary's amazing library to find the primary records of these what was going, the interactions from 300 or 400 years ago. And also at SICE with the Strategic Studies program, Dr. Cohen was a real stickler for archival research. Yeah.
Yes, he is.
So I feel like I learned a lot from both of those programs. And then as a journalist, I was always applying that. I was always, even as a reporter in Alexandria, the local reporter, I was always going to the some of the local history archives in Alexandria or elsewhere, and looking, working with the local historians to find some of the archival material. So I think part of it came naturally to me anyway, but also I was lucky to have teachers at all levels who kind of emphasized that.
Yeah, I had that experience in Ann Arbor too, working as an undergraduate. We got to work in 19th century documents, and I was amazed that they would let an undergraduate, pull out these Civil War letters from Michigan soldiers and let us kind of flip through them. I was stunned. I'm still stunned at what they let researchers just walk off the streets and look at places like the National Archives.
Yeah, I was amazed by that too. In the 1814 campaign, you're handling letters that Francis Scott Key or other figures wrote, personally. You're just you really feel nervous actually touching them.
French military archives have these beautiful hand-drawn full-color Napoleonic maps that they'll just let people take out and look at, and I'm still astonished. I understand it's a little harder to see them now than it was when I saw them maybe 20 years ago. But
right.
So I want to ask you a couple more quick questions, because we are running out of time. Are you working on or thinking about a book next, or are you not at that stage just yet?
I'm thinking about actually a book about the Korean War. I'm not haven't decided yet, but one of the stories I covered as a reporter involved the U.S. Army experience at Chosin Reservoir, and I covered during the 50th anniversary of the Korean War back in 2000. I met a lot of those guys. They were finally awarded a Presidential Unit Citation for their heroism there, because they were kind of I guess overlooked, or even worse. The Marines, everybody knows the great proud Marine story at Chosin, but the Army had a different experience there, but I think there was a lot of heroism and just real bravery there. And I've always been fascinated by that story, and I've thought about going back to look at that in more detail.
Well, good. That'll bring you to Carlisle, because some of the sources must be up here.
Definitely. They definitely are.
So I want to wrap up. Would you please tell our listeners where you are actually sitting right now, and tell us a little bit about your workspace, because you graciously invited me to come down there, and I have been green with envy ever since.
Yeah, it's an old log cabin. I live in the tiny town of Barnesville, Maryland, which is in upper Montgomery County. And there's an area known as the Agricultural Reserve. And it's, kind of a real mix of old homes and newer homes. But the home where we live is, about 200 years old. And there's a log cabin in the back that's been restored. And I, of course, immediately claimed it as my office. And, it's kind of quirky. It's got a wood stove so I can keep from freezing to death in the winter. And, there's all types of critters, various bugs that sometimes crawl in. But it's wonderful because, I've got kids back in the house, and they're especially in past years, there could be a lot of drama and rage going on back in the house. But out here, I'm just I've got my own world, and it's just I never get tired of sitting out here. These old hand-hewn timbers, and strange oddities about this cabin. I find anyway help me work.
Well, except for the bugs, it is an absolute writer's paradise to be back there. So I'm envious of you. It must be just a perfect place to sit down and think. Well, Steve,
Yeah.
I'm really grateful for you taking the time. I know how busy you are, and I know how many directions you're being pulled. But it was great having you here, and I hope you do work on the Chosen Reservoir book, and I hope it brings you to Carlisle very often.
Yeah, I would love to do that. It'd be great to see you again soon.
Great talking to you, Steve. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, that was fun. Really enjoyed it.
And that concludes our program. Thank you for listening. The views expressed in this podcast reflect those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views, policies, or positions of the U.S. Army or the Department of Defense. Let us know what you think. Provide us your feedback, comments, or suggestions through our webpage at warroom.armywarcollege.edu. And have a great day.